We often focus on "come and take it," "remember the Alamo," and the glory of the Battle of San Jacinto when we think about Texas history. However, much of the 1800s was a very difficult and dark period in the state's history. And today we are going to talk about one of the darkest chapters, one that makes many of us uncomfortable. But in my experience, it's the times that I've gotten out of my comfort zone when I experienced the greatest personal growth. When Moses Austin went to San Antonio to negotiate bringing settlers to Texas in 1820, he brought a slave along with him. There he persuaded the Spanish governor to allow him to settle 300 families and create a town along the Colorado River. Stephen Austin, his son, began bringing settlers to Texas in 1821 with permission from Spain, then Mexico. He and most of the other early leaders of Texas supported the practice of slavery. The majority of early settlers in Austin's colony were from the South. So in order to fulfill his impresario contract with Mexico, he needed slavery to be allowed. Stephen Austin was to receive 97,000 acres of land for fulfilling his contract and would also collect fees from each family. So you can easily see his incentive for promoting the practice. In 1821, Mexico was a brand new country, desperate to stabilize its vast territory. There were only 3,000 to 4,000 Mexicans and a few widely scattered settlements in Texas. And they were vastly outnumbered by various groups of Native Americans that frequently raided their settlements. This, combined with the proximity to the South, set the stage for the introduction of slavery. In the year 1819, Texas only had about 40 people of African descent. The early settlers grew cotton and wanted slave labor to maximize production. In 1822, 90 slaves arrived at Varner Hog Plantation near Hempstead, the first large-scale operation of its kind in Texas. By 1825, slaves made up 25% of the population of Austin's colony, and he even used them in fighting Native Americans in the area. In 1825, Mexico passed a colonization law that awarded 5 leagues of grazing and 5 labors of farmland for every 100 families that the impresarios helped settle, which is about 23,000 total acres. Ultimately, Austin received a total of 5 contracts and settled about 1,800 families in Texas. Multiple other impresarios were awarded contracts in the mid-1820s. Mexico began passing laws in 1827 to weaken the practice of slavery and outright banned it in 1829. But Stephen Austin, a clever man, kept finding loopholes and made arguments in support of the practice. He accomplished a great deal in his short life in Texas and was a brilliant advocate and negotiator. But this certainly leaves a stain on his legacy and the history of Texas. By the 1850s, about 19% of families in Texas owned at least one slave, which constituted about 30% of the total population. In 1860, there were over 180,000 total slaves in Texas, most of which lived in the eastern 40% of the state. The majority of slave-owning families in Texas had less than 10. Only 3% owned 20 or more, and these tended to be the wealthiest families in the state. So out in the Brazoria County countryside lies the Levi Jordan Plantation. He and his 12 slaves moved to Texas in 1848. Before the Civil War, the plantation grew sugarcane and cotton. The number of slaves here grew to 134. After the emancipation, he hired many of his former slaves as sharecroppers. So now we're back here at the Varner Hog Plantation in the town of West Columbia. In 1824, Martin Varner of Virginia received a league of land from Stephen Austin. He only maintained a few slaves on the property. In 1834, he sold it to Columbus Patton of Kentucky. Patton had a much larger group of slaves here, around 50. They built the plantation house, a sugar mill, and their own quarters. Patton had a controversial romantic relationship with one of his slaves named Rachel. In 1854, he developed a brain tumor and was declared insane, then placed in an asylum. Years later, the sugar mill here was destroyed in a hurricane in 1900. I must admit, this plantation is one of the loveliest and most peaceful places I've seen in Texas. It's a great place to reflect on our wrongdoings of the past.